What are the most urbanist neighborhoods in Australia, the Southern Hemisphere version of Canada? Let's take a look based on the 2021 Australian census. We're going to measure urbanism based on 3 categories. First, population density. The denser the better. This is not to say that anyone into cities and urbanism must always prefer the highest density environments, but it is the simplest way to compare. Number 2, affordability. The cheaper the median rent, the better. And the third category is transportation, under which we're including 3 separate measures. The percentage of people who commute by transit, the percentage of people who commute by walking or cycling, and the number of motor vehicles owned per household, with lower being better. When we say we're looking at neighborhoods, we're looking at statistical areas level 2, which have an average population of 10,000 people. When possible, these line up with established boundaries of suburbs and localities in Australia. Contrary to suburb in North America meaning an outlying, lower-density residential area, Australians use the term suburb for neighbourhoods even in the central city.
We started with the 2,500 statistical areas that cover all of Australia, but then excluded the ones that were too rural to be relevant, leaving us with 1,400 neighbourhoods that are at least somewhat urban, with a total population of 17 million people. Among these 1,400 or so urban neighbourhoods, based on our categories and weightings, the 10th most urbanist neighbourhood or suburb in Australia is Surrey Hills in Sydney, just southeast of the Central Business District or CBD, which fits 16,000 people into 1.3 square kilometres, for a density of 12,000 people per square kilometre. Active commuting is especially strong here, with over 40% of people getting to work by walking or cycling, although there's also light rail going through the middle, and this area is right beside Sydney's Central Station for trains. Each household owns 0.7 cars on average, much lower than the Australian average of 1.8.
Number 9 is Potts Point, Woolloomooloo, also in central Sydney, and quite similar to Surrey Hills on the metrics we're using here. Both areas have high rents but also high family incomes, so they'd rise a bit in the rankings if we adjusted rent to a percentage of income, but we didn't do that. When comparing different countries, you want to adjust housing prices for local incomes, because moving to another country gives you the jobs and salaries of that country. You probably even want to adjust for incomes when comparing different metro areas within a country, although there can still be a problem of more expensive metro areas just pricing lower income people out. But we're not adjusting neighborhood housing costs by neighborhood incomes here because, for the most part, different neighborhoods within a city don't actually have different job markets, unless maybe one neighborhood has better transportation access to jobs.
For number 8, we're off to Melbourne for a neighbourhood called Carlton, just north of the CBD and south of the University of Melbourne. This area is a bit less dense than the other ones on our top 10, at about 9,000 people per square kilometre. It also has the second lowest rent, at $365 a week, as Australians usually report it, or $1,600 a month for the rest of us. Keep in mind that median rent in a census covers what all renters were paying at the time of the census, in this case 2021, which is usually lower than the market rent for currently available apartments if you were to look now.
Number 7 takes us back to Sydney for Ultimo, a mostly mid-rise neighbourhood southwest of the CBD, containing the University of Technology, Sydney. Of all the metrics, this one has its best performance on active transportation. This comes up in US Census data too. Colleges and universities are big hotspots for active commuting. We're now down to 0.6 cars per household, from 0.7 in the last few neighbourhoods.
Number 6 is another neighbourhood in Sydney called Chippendale, which drops down to 0.5 cars per household. This area is denser than the other ones so far, at 17,000 people per square kilometre, and it would be higher if the borders didn't include a big chunk of railway space. The density comes from a mix of densely built low-rises, plus a cluster of mixed-use high-rises in the north that turned from a factory in the late 2000s to the neighbourhood of today. This area is a good example of how low-rises and high-rises are perfectly fine mixed together in a neighbourhood. If the low-rises are built tightly with narrow streets and lots of street trees, you probably can't even see the high-rises, if you happen to be someone who doesn't like the look of taller buildings.
Number 5 is another nearby neighbourhood, Sydney South Haymarket, just on the southern edge of the CBD. Transit commuting is inching up higher here compared to the previous neighbourhoods, approaching 40%, which combined with just over 40% of people on active commutes, leaves not a lot of people driving. The density here is higher than any of the neighborhoods we've seen yet, at 18,000 people per square kilometer, although that undercounts the height and density of the buildings, because population density doesn't account for offices and hotels, which are common here given that this is basically the southern tip of downtown.
The final 4 neighborhoods on our list are all clustered together in central Melbourne. Number 4 is Melbourne CBD East, which drops down to 0.4 cars per household. Number 3 is South Bank East, the second densest neighborhood on our top 10, but also the one with the highest car ownership at 0.7 per household, maybe because of the very close highway access. Number 2 is CBD West, which has the highest transit commuting rate at 46%. And finally, in first place, we have Melbourne CBD North, which has the highest population density in Australia at 30,000 people per square kilometre, the lowest vehicle ownership in the country at 0.3 per household, and surprisingly low rent for the location. It's not the cheapest neighborhood out there, but it's the cheapest one on our top 10. Again, census rents don't necessarily reflect the market rent if you want to rent a place today, but we're just using them to compare different neighborhoods. One more thing to keep in mind is that looking at bigger neighborhoods or suburbs like this means that we're not going to see the highest density spikes that you'd see looking at individual blocks or even buildings. If we use Australia's smaller census units, statistical areas level 1, the highest density in the country is Union Tower in central Melbourne, which is 35 stories tall and covers the entire lot for a density of about 550,000 people per square kilometre.
In these results, it was a little surprising just how much the urbanist neighborhoods clustered right beside, or even in, the central business districts of Sydney and Melbourne. We thought the list might end up a bit more balanced, with neighborhoods closer to downtown with the highest densities and active commuting, interspersed with neighborhoods a bit further out, that have higher transit use and maybe lower rents than downtown. Some of the very central neighborhoods did only have medium rates of transit use, around 20% in Potts Point, Woolloomooloo, and Surrey Hills in Sydney. But areas directly in the Melbourne CBD still had very high rates of transit commuting, around 40%. That's higher than we'd expect, whether they're using transit for short distances downtown, or maybe some are reverse commuting further out. This high transit ridership, combined with equally higher rates of active commuting, high densities, low car ownership, and surprisingly low rents relative to other areas, resulted in the Melbourne CBD coming out on top as the most urbanist area of Australia. With that said, the number 11 most urbanist suburb on our list is Wally Creek, well outside of the CBD in Sydney, accessible in about 20 minutes by train, with high rates of transit commuting and pretty high densities, at least near the train station. Going further down, the first neighborhoods on this ranking that aren't in Sydney or Melbourne are at number 22 and 24, Brisbane City and Fortitude Valley. If you go all the way to the top 50, you'll hit some areas in Adelaide and Perth too.
This video was fun because we were able to use data as a starting point to explore a country that feels eerily similar to Canada, even down to Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane lining up in size with Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, respectively. We appreciated that Australia has these standardized boundaries for suburbs or neighborhoods too. Canada doesn't have nationwide standard definitions for neighborhoods. Vancouver has 22 official neighborhoods, but Montreal and Toronto have wards or boroughs for political representation that don't exactly line up with real neighborhoods. We lived for a few years in Toronto in the ward that is now University Rosedale, but the area by the university with all the students and professors is quite different from the mansions and old money of Rosedale. Canada and the US do have census tracts that we use in a lot of videos, but they're smaller and they don't really line up coherently with neighborhoods that you can identify. The US has zip codes, which people sometimes use and identify with, but they vary a lot in population and don't neatly line up with actual communities, like the suburbs in Australia seem to.
If you'd like to look up your own suburb, we've linked a spreadsheet down below with stats for all 1,400 neighborhoods that were included in this analysis. As you'll see, there are some anomalies and weird results. The 42nd most urbanist neighborhood in the country is Duntroon in Canberra. Doesn't look very urbanist, does it? This is the site of the Royal Military College of Australia, and while the density is low, it has a wildly high rate of active commuting at 80%, plus low median rents. Examples like this show the limitations of trying to quantify a concept as broad as urbanism with just a few metrics, let alone metrics that happen to be available in the census. With that said, it's interesting to see how far a few numbers can take us. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.